Was he out of his mind? That's what a stranger yelled at me while I was climbing over a collapsed fence toward a burning shed, smoke thick enough to swallow the porch light whole. Somebody grabbed my jacket and told me the propane tank could go any second. I shook them off. 2 hours earlier, all I'd wanted was a ride from the train station. I just scattered my wife's ashes off the pier she loved, then caught the 410 back into the city alone. I texted my son and daughter, pulling in at 6. Any chance one of you can swing by? My son wrote back, kind of swamped tonight. Just take the train home. You know the way. My daughter added a minute later, Dad, you really should have told us earlier so we could plan around it. I only answered, no problem. 6 hours later, half the neighborhood knew my name from a video of a gray-haired man in a soaked flannel shirt pulling 2 kids out of a burning shed behind a house on Larkspur Lane. By the next morning, the local news had my full name spelled right for once. Only my daughter still didn't know. The first she heard of it wasn't from me, wasn't from a phone call. It was from her hairdresser, who had the footage playing on a phone propped against the mirror while she cut Rachel's hair. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 64. Spent 31 years as a machinist before my knees gave out on me, and for most of my life I was the kind of man who fixed things in silence and never asked anybody to notice. My wife Carol was the one who remembered everybody's birthday, who kept the Christmas cards flowing every December, who could talk to a stranger in a checkout line like they'd known each other for years. I was happiest with my hands inside an engine or up a ladder clearing the gutters before the first frost. Carol used to tease me, said I was the kind of man people trusted with their secrets because I never once made them feel like a burden. Maybe she was right. Or maybe I just never wanted the people I loved carrying anything heavier than they had to. That habit of mine nearly cost me something I didn't see coming. 4 days before the fire, I stood on a dock in Cape May watching the wind carry Carol out over the water the way she'd asked me to, years before any of us thought we'd need to think about it. She'd fought the same battle for 18 months, chemo and then not chemo, one more trial and then no more trials, until one quiet Sunday morning there was nothing left to fight. If you've ever sat next to a hospital bed holding somebody's hand while a machine counted down the only thing left to count, you already understand there's no bracing yourself for what comes after. It doesn't knock first. It just moves into the house and stays. The service was small, the way she wanted it. No big flowers, she always called those a waste of good money that could go somewhere useful. Just a handful of people who actually knew her, and her favorite Patsy Cline record playing low from a little speaker somebody set on the folding table. Afterward I stood by the water until the man from the funeral home gently reminded me they needed to lock the gate. Come back tomorrow if you want, he said. I told him tomorrow already felt like a different year. The next morning I packed one bag and took the train back toward the city, wearing the ring I couldn't picture taking off. Carol used to grab my arm during turbulence on flights and tell me if we landed safe she was ordering the biggest plate of crab cakes on the menu. This time, the empty seat next to me on the train said everything turbulence never could. We pulled into the station a little after 6. I sat there while everybody else filed off in a hurry, because nobody was standing on the platform waiting for me. I opened the family text thread, me and my son Gary, my daughter Rachel, Gary's wife Denise, a scattering of cousins who mostly posted pictures of their dogs. I typed it out slow. Pulling in at 6. Any chance one of you can swing by the station? I read it back twice before I hit send. Asking my own kids for a favor never came easy to me, not once in their whole lives. Gary answered first. Kinda swamped tonight, sorry. Just grab the train home, you know the way from the platform. Rachel answered a few minutes after that. Dad, you really should have told us earlier so we could plan around it. Plan around it. Like grief kept office hours. Like burying your mother's ashes ought to fit neatly between somebody's soccer carpool and a Tuesday conference call. I could have told them where I'd just come from. I could have said I scattered their mother that afternoon and all I wanted in the whole world was one familiar face waiting for me, instead of an empty platform. Instead I typed 2 words. No problem. Then I put the phone away, not because it was fine, but because I finally understood something plain and simple. You cannot make people show up for you. You can only notice, quietly, when they don't. Outside, the city gave me a light rain and the ordinary noise of a Tuesday evening, buses hissing, somebody's radio too loud, life carrying on exactly the way it always had, not caring one bit that mine had just split down the middle. I started the walk toward my building, cutting through the side streets the way I always did to save 15 minutes. My knees ached, not from the walk, from weeks of maybe 3 hours of sleep a night. Near the corner of Larkspur Lane, I saw a young mother wrestling two grocery bags and a stroller up a set of porch steps, the wheel caught on the bottom stair. I walked over and helped her get it loose without thinking twice about it. She thanked me, said she hoped somebody would return the favor for me someday. I told her I hoped so too. That's when the smoke started rolling up over the fence line behind the house, 2 doors down. A space heater had tipped in a converted garden shed where a family used to store bikes and now let their 2 boys use as a playroom, and it caught the old wood siding fast, the kind of dry timber that goes up in a hurry. People were already gathering on the sidewalk, phones out, nobody moving closer. Somebody screamed that there were kids inside, that the mother had run next door to grab a fire extinguisher and hadn't come back yet. Smoke was pouring out from under the door in a thick gray wall. Somebody grabbed my sleeve and told me not to be a fool. I pulled free anyway. Years back, long before the knees gave out, I'd spent a stretch running safety drills on the plant floor. Fire suppression, chemical spill response, the kind of training you pray you never actually need. Instinct got there before fear had a chance to weigh in. I ran for the shed door. It was locked from a latch that had swollen shut in the heat. I grabbed a cinder block from the edge of somebody's garden bed and swung it into the small window twice before the glass gave way. Smoke rolled out over me thick enough to taste, and somewhere behind it I could hear a kid coughing, high and scared. I want to be honest about this part, because I think it's the part people skip past too fast when they hear a story like mine. Nobody who runs toward a fire is thinking about being brave. There's no decision in it. It's just what's left standing, once grief has already burned every other thing down to the studs. I reached through the broken window and unlatched the door from the inside, glass cutting a line across my forearm I didn't feel until later. 2 boys, maybe 7 and 9, were huddled against the far wall where the smoke was thinnest. I got the younger one over my shoulder and told the older one to grab my belt and not let go for anything. We came out into the yard together just as their mother came sprinting back around the side of the house, fire extinguisher useless in her hands, screaming their names. I want you to understand something, because I think about it more than almost anything else from that night. All I could think, kneeling in that yard with a scared kid coughing into my shoulder, was one simple thing. Carol would never have forgiven me if I let another family go through losing somebody the way I just had. The fire department had it out within 20 minutes. A young officer with a clipboard asked my name and I told him, Walter Pruitt, 64. He looked at me a beat too long and asked if I wanted to sit in the ambulance a minute. I told him I'd had worse. He almost smiled and said every man over 60 says exactly that. The word wife would have hit me different a week earlier. That night it landed like a second collision. I buried mine 4 days ago, I told him, and watched whatever he'd been about to say next disappear off his face entirely. A neighbor who'd caught the whole thing on her doorbell camera kept insisting to anybody who'd listened that I'd gone in twice, once for each boy, while everybody else just stood there filming. A college kid backed her up, said the firefighters told him the extra minutes were the whole reason those boys made it out without worse than smoke in their lungs. I hadn't been counting trips. I'd just seen kids who needed somebody. A young paramedic wrapped my arm and asked if I had family coming to get me. I told her they were busy tonight. She didn't push, just handed me a bottle of water and said she hoped somebody was giving me a ride home. So did I. A local reporter named Marisol Vega came over with a cameraman trailing behind her, asked if I'd answer a couple questions. I told her I really wasn't interested in being on the news. She said the fire chief was telling everybody those boys don't walk away from that shed without me. I told her I was just glad they were okay, and that was really all I had to say. She nodded, and actually backed off without pushing it further, which surprised me more than it should have. Carol always had a soft spot for people who could take no for a full answer. I remember thinking Marisol Vega might be one of those people. Because the block was still roped off with fire trucks and hoses everywhere, a police officer offered to run me the rest of the way home in his cruiser. I said yes and sat quiet in the back seat, holding the small canvas bag Carol had packed for the trip to Cape May, a cardigan in it she'd worn maybe twice in her life, and I breathed in whatever was left of her perfume on it the whole ride. That's when I finally cried. Not for the fire, not for the cut on my arm, for the plain fact that there would never again be a text from Carol asking if I'd made it home safe. Across town, my kids had no idea where I was. Gary had just sat down to dinner with Denise and their daughter when his phone lit up. A neighbor first, then a guy from his softball league, then his own sister-in-law. "Turn on Channel 9, the softball guy said, and hung up before Gary could ask why. The footage was already running on a loop. A gray-haired man in a soaked flannel shirt, carrying a kid out of smoke, going back in for the second one. Denise went pale before Gary had even finished processing what he was looking at. "Is that your dad?" she asked. He couldn't get words out. His throat had shut down completely. Across the city, my daughter Rachel got almost the same call from her friend Priya. "I think your father's on the news," Priya said. Rachel laughed it off right up until she flipped on the television at her hairdresser's and had to sit back down in the chair. Then the anchor read a detail that stopped her cold. Walter Pruitt had reportedly come straight from a memorial service earlier that same evening for his wife of 39 years. Rachel had been so buried in a work deadline and getting her own kids to practice that she hadn't spared a single thought that whole week for what that lonely train ride home must have felt like for her father. "I want to slow down here, because I think this matters more than the fire or the broken glass ever did." Most people like to believe they'd never say something as cold as just grab the train to a parent who buried their spouse that same afternoon. But burnout doesn't send up a flare either. It just quietly steers your attention away from exactly the person who needs it most, until a stranger's video forces you to look straight at what you missed. My phone stayed face down on the kitchen counter all night. I never felt it buzzing, never saw the calls stacking up, 40 some of them by morning. For the first time in longer than I could remember, everybody suddenly wanted to know where I was. I woke a little before 6. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot everything. Forgot Carol was gone. Forgot the smoke and the glass. Then I reached across the bed out of old habit and found only cold sheets, and it all came rushing back at once. I left the television off. I'd spent 31 years fixing things quiet and slipping out before anybody could make a fuss over it. Recognition had never once been the point for me. Around 8, there was a knock at my door. It was Marisol Vega, looking almost sheepish about it. Somebody at the station had tracked down my address from the police report. She said she wasn't there to shove a camera in my face. She just had a message from St. Agnes Hospital. Both boys were going to be fine, a little smoke in their lungs, and nothing worse, and the younger one kept asking the nurses about the man who broke the window. I laughed for the first time in days. Told Marisol I figured his mother was also telling him never to try climbing through broken glass himself. She smiled and said there were a dozen reporters camped at the end of my block already. I asked her to keep my address to herself. She gave me her word, and for the first time since any of this started, I believed there was still such a thing as a decent reporter left in this business. Meanwhile, Gary and Rachel had met outside my house at 7 that morning using the spare key I'd given Gary years back for emergencies. Everything sat exactly the way I'd left it. Carol's reading chair angled toward the window, my work boots by the back door, no smell of coffee brewing because for 39 years she'd always been up before me to start the pot. Rachel noticed a little dish on the kitchen table, holding a few dried flowers from the service. "Mom's flowers," she said quietly. Neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. The quiet in that house was louder than anything either of them could have said out loud. "We should straighten up before Dad gets back," Rachel finally said, mostly because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. While she was dusting the shelf in the hallway closet, she found an old metal toolbox tucked behind Carol's winter coats that she'd never once noticed before. Inside weren't tools. It was letters, photographs, and a stack of small spiral notebooks, each one dated on the cover in Carol's tidy handwriting. "I don't think we should read these," Rachel said. "I think Mom would have wanted us to," Gary answered, though he didn't sound entirely sure either. The early pages were nothing much. Birthdays, a vacation to the shore, a complaint or two about a noisy neighbor. Then one entry stopped them both cold. Carol had written that I'd quietly sold my old boat to help cover the down payment on Gary's first house, and made me swear never to tell him why, because Gary would never have taken the money if he'd known where it came from. Gary went white reading it. "He told me he just wasn't using the boat anymore," he said. Rachel turned another page and found an entry about her own divorce, how I'd pulled money straight out of my retirement to cover her lawyer's fees, then told the kids afterward we'd simply decided to downsize the house for no particular reason. "I actually thought that was our idea," she said, hand pressed over her mouth. They kept reading, entry after entry. Me picking up weekend shifts after I'd already retired, not out of boredom the way I always claimed, but because Gary's small business had nearly gone under one bad winter. Me putting off a new truck for 6 straight years because Rachel's oldest needed braces 2 years running. Me skipping our one planned trip to see the Grand Canyon because tuition kept climbing faster than either of us expected. never once complaining about any of it, never once asking to be paid back a dime. Then Rachel found an entry from only 5 months earlier and read it out loud, her voice cracking about halfway through. Carol had written about the last round of treatment, how I'd emptied out nearly everything left in our savings without a second thought, how I'd smiled the whole time signing the paperwork so she wouldn't have to see what it was actually costing me. She'd ended the entry saying she hoped that, if she didn't make it, her children would never mistake my quiet for indifference, because underneath it was the biggest heart she'd ever known in anybody. Gary sat down hard on the bottom stair, elbows on his knees, shoulders shaking. "I thought Dad was just tight with money," he said. "So did I," Rachel answered. Neither of them had ever once wondered why I drove the same truck for over a decade, or wore the same coat every winter, or always said I was doing just fine whenever anybody asked. Believing something takes so much less effort than actually questioning it. If you've ever found out too late exactly how much somebody quietly gave up for you while swearing up and down they were fine, you already know there isn't an apology big enough to cover that kind of not looking. Around noon, Gary's wife Denise showed up with sandwiches and knew something was wrong the second she walked in. She read 2 pages of one notebook and sat down next to her husband without saying a word. "I told him to just take the train," Gary said quietly. His wife was in the ground that same afternoon, and I told him to take the train. Across the city, I was sitting alone on a bench overlooking the river. The same water Carol used to say reminded her that life was always in the business of carrying somebody home eventually. My phone rang. This time, I picked up. For several seconds, Gary couldn't get a word out at all. Finally, through tears, 4 words. "Dad, please come home." Words I would have given almost anything to hear the night before. Words that showed up a little too late to land the way they should have. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask what had changed his mind. I just told him I wasn't ready yet, and ended the call, not to punish him, but because some hearts need room to breathe a while before they can hold forgiveness without cracking under the weight of it. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking along the river. Joggers passed. A couple of kids fed the ducks near the footbridge. Somebody's radio drifted out from an open window, like nothing in the world had changed, because for them it hadn't. Carol always said the world keeps right on turning whether or not we're ready to keep walking alongside it. That afternoon, I wasn't sure I remembered how. Marisol called again that evening, not for an interview this time, she made sure to say. Just to pass along that, the fire department wanted to give me some kind of commendation, and so did the mayor's office, and so did the boy's family. I told her I wasn't interested in any of that. She said she understood completely, but there was one more thing she wanted to ask. She wanted to get the story right, because every station in the market was already calling me a hero and inventing their own reasons why I'd been walking home alone that night in the first place. "They don't need to know," I told her. "I think maybe they do," she said. "Loneliness is something a lot more people understand than heroism ever will be." Then she told me her own mother had passed alone in a care facility during the worst of the pandemic, and she never got the chance to say a proper goodbye. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. I agreed to one interview. No politics, no dramatic music laid over it, and if I didn't care for a question, I didn't have to answer it. She agreed to every bit of that. We filmed it the next morning in a quiet room at the fire station, 2 folding chairs and 1 camera. She asked why I kept going back in for the second boy. I told her that after 39 years loving one person, fear stops carrying the weight it used to. You stop asking whether something's dangerous and start asking only whether somebody in there needs you. Then she asked the question I'd known was coming the whole time. Did my family know I was coming home that night? I had every reason in the world to just tell the truth right there on camera. I could have let a whole viewing audience judge my kids the exact same way I'd judged them alone in my kitchen the night before. Instead, I said, they've got a lot on their plates. I said they were raising their own kids and building careers and juggling more than I ever had to at their age. Of course, they couldn't make it. Marisol studied me for a long moment. "You don't sound angry about it," she said. "I've had about enough sadness this week already," I told her. Didn't feel like stacking anger on top of it. That one sentence, "they've got a lot on their plates," is the part that ended up everywhere, not the fire, not the broken glass. That sentence, because something like 80,000 people apparently saw their own family in it. One woman wrote that her own mother said that same exact phrase every single time she forgot to call. Somebody else wrote that they booked a flight home for the following weekend the same night they saw the clip. If you've ever caught yourself making excuses for somebody who let you down, only because you love them too much to say the real thing out loud, You already know exactly why that sentence landed the way it did. Gary watched the interview alone in his car in a parking lot and sat there afterward with his head against the steering wheel for a long time. Rachel watched it from her kitchen while her youngest daughter climbed up on a stool beside her and asked, innocent as anything, why Grandpa was saying such nice things about people who'd hurt his feelings. Rachel didn't have an answer ready. Most grown adults wouldn't have either. That night, my porch quietly filled up with casseroles and handwritten cards from neighbors I mostly only waved at. Somebody trimmed my hedges without ever ringing the bell. Somebody else raked the yard. Nobody made a production of it. They just went ahead and did for me exactly what I'd apparently been doing for that street for close to 20 years, without anybody quite noticing. When I finally walked home that evening, 2 folding chairs sat waiting on my porch. Gary in one, Rachel in the other, neither one looking at their phone. None of us moved for a long moment. I want to slow down again here, because I think this is the part of the whole thing that matters more than any fire ever could. Gary stood up first and asked if he could carry my bag inside, and it hit me that the last time he'd carried a bag of mine, he'd been maybe 11 years old. Rachel said she'd made coffee using Carol's old recipe. It didn't taste quite right. We both laughed about that together, and it was the first real laugh either of us had managed since the service. Inside, the counters were covered in dishes and cards from people I could barely place. Gary finally admitted outright that they'd found the notebooks. I told him I figured that day would come eventually, one way or another. He asked if I'd wanted them to find it. I told him it was their mother's, and it was never mine to hide from either of them. We sat at the same table, where Carol had hosted 39 Thanksgivings, no television on, no phones out, just coffee going cold in front of 3 people, finally willing to say the hard things straight out loud. Gary asked why I never told him about the boat. I told him helping him out was never supposed to become one more weight for him to carry around. Rachel asked why I let her believe downsizing had been our own idea. I told her Carol wanted her to keep her dignity through the divorce. Nothing more complicated than that. Then Gary asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him since the interview aired. Why hadn't I told the truth on camera? Why hadn't I let the whole world see exactly what they'd said to me the night their mother's ashes went into the water? I told him public shame doesn't heal a private wound, and that Carol never once believed in tearing somebody down just to watch them squirm over it. Accountability, she used to say, ought to lead somewhere. It shouldn't just leave a person broken out on the far side of it. Rachel asked quietly if I'd been angry with them. I told her, of course I had been. She said I sure hadn't looked it on camera. I told her, 39 years of marriage teaches a man that speaking his mind while he's still furious only hands him a second mess to clean up the next morning. A few days later, the 3 of us drove out to the pier in Cape May, where I'd scattered Carol's ashes exactly the way she'd asked me to. Gary apologized out loud to the water. Rachel said she'd forgotten how much I'd quietly been caring for both of them their whole lives. I told them most of raising kids is teaching them how to walk, and the hardest lesson still left after that is teaching them how to walk back when they need to. Gary broke down completely then, and it wasn't the stiff, fast hug grown sons give their fathers out of habit. It was the kind of hug a scared kid gives when he understands exactly how close he came to losing the one person who'd been quietly holding his whole world together the entire time. In the weeks after, Gary started showing up Tuesday mornings with 2 coffees, no reason given, just because he felt like it. Rachel started coming by Sunday evenings with soup that never tasted quite like Carol's. She admitted she was missing some ingredient she couldn't place. I told her the ingredient was patience, and Carol never once treated that as optional. My granddaughter Emma wandered into the garage one Saturday and asked if I'd teach her how to build something. We spent the whole afternoon on a crooked little birdhouse, and when she apologized for how lopsided it turned out, I told her families are rarely perfectly square either, but if the foundation's solid enough, they still manage to stand. A month or so later, the fire department asked if I'd say a few words at a community safety event downtown. I nearly said no. Then I remembered something Carol used to tell me, that if your own hard experience can help somebody else, it stops belonging only to you. So I said yes. Near the end, somebody in the crowd asked what made me run toward that shed instead of away from it, like everybody else on the sidewalk that night. I told them my wife spent 18 months teaching me that once somebody you love is fighting for their life, you stop waiting around for somebody else to step up in your place. The mistake most families make isn't one big betrayal you can point to. It's 1,000 small put-offs, a text left on read, a visit canceled and rescheduled and canceled again, The quiet assumption that there's always going to be one more chance to make it right later. Sometimes there isn't. If there's one thing I'd ask you to actually go do today, not just sit and think about, it's this. Call whoever it is you've been meaning to call. Not next week, today. And ask yourself honestly, is there somebody in your life you've just quietly assumed will always be there whenever you finally get around to picking up the phone? I'd really love to hear from you down in the comments. Comment 1 if you think I was right to protect my kids on camera that day. Comment 2 if you think the world deserved the whole truth instead. And comment 3 if you're honestly torn between the two the same way I still am some nights. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, son or daughter, husband or wife, whoever's sitting there with you, and what time it is where you are, because it never stops amazing me how many time zones end up sitting here with me in this same quiet moment. And if any piece of this reminded you of your own family, I'd love to hear that too. If this story meant something to you tonight, stick around a little longer and think about subscribing, because I've got more stories like this one about the quiet things we carry for each other that don't get noticed until it's almost too late. Until next time, take care of yourself, and don't wait around for a headline to remind you who's been carrying you all along.